We are seeing a stunning turn of events in Ukraine 6 months after Russia's unprovoked invasion. The Ukrainian military has succeeded in taking a broad swath of territory in the northeastern part of the country, forcing Russian soldiers to retreat.
On the 200th day of war, Ukrainians celebrating a surprising victory. Soldiers breaking Russia's military stranglehold on parts of the country and reclaiming territory at lightning speed. Ukraine saying its forces have recaptured more villages. A total of more than 1,100 square miles since launching the counteroffensive 2 weeks ago, liberating more than 30 settlements, mostly in the northeast. The Russian military's grip on the northeastern territory of Kharkiv crumbling, its soldiers retreating, leaving tanks and artillery behind. In a rare admission of a setback, Russia saying it's not fleeing, it's regrouping.
Now, to my mind, this is unexpected good news following months of a discouraging stalemate, and it's shifting attitudes about how this war might come to an end. Back in February, when Russia launched their initial attack, it seemed like there were basically three possible outcomes. The first, and at the beginning perhaps most likely or most anticipated, was a swift, outright Russian victory. But within just a couple of weeks, as Ukraine beat back Russian forces, protected their capital, Kyiv, it became clear that that wasn't going to happen. That ship had sailed. Then the second possibility was some kind of negotiated peace between the two sides, after both sides came to a point where the cost of continuing to fight would be higher than the possibility of a victory. Until recently, that seemed to me the most likely end in some iteration. It would probably require some very painful concessions on Ukraine's part. For instance, Crimea remaining in Russia's orbit, some sort of quasi-independence for the southeastern states of Donetsk and Luhansk. And then the third option seemed the most remote, just an outright Ukrainian military victory. They just beat the Russians. Even after Ukraine repelled Russia's first advance and during the stalemate that followed, conquering territory is always much harder than holding it, and Russia had conquered a fair amount, was holding it. That is exactly what Ukraine has now done. They've retaken back territory in a major successful offensive military operation that brings new hope to the Ukrainians and their allies. And the news of this utter rout seems to have actually gotten through to the Russian people. Reaction is manifesting in a fascinating way on state TV, where a former opposition lawmaker publicly stated the current strategy is not working and argues that Russia needs to make peace.
Мы подошли к черте, за которой надо вот просто понимать простую вещь. Победить Украину теми ресурсами, которые сейчас Россия там пытается воевать в режиме колониальной войны, да? Контрактники воюют, там, значит, ЧВК и так далее, мобилизации нет.
За риторикой следите.
Ну, это невозможно абсолютно, потому что российской армии там противостоит вообще сильная армия, которая по полной программе поддерживает сильнейшие в экономическом, технологическом отношении государства Европы, да, в частности.
То есть вы предлагаете мобилизацию провести,
слушайте,
военную
вот
мобилизацию, не мобилизацию там сознания или экономики?
Начать переговоры о прекращении войны
понятно,
и перейти к политическим вопросам.
So the first time in 200 days of war, I think this is a really encouraging situation, both in the Russian airwaves and on the ground in Ukraine. Ben Rhodes served as Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama, now co-hosts the podcast Pod Save the World, and he joins me now. Ben, it's been very hard. I mean, there's a real fog of war problem with trying to track in real time advances, defeats, obviously a tremendous amount of propaganda, but it does seem quite established in the last 4 or 5 days, a pretty remarkably successful counteroffensive by the Ukrainians. What's the significance here?
I think the significance, Chris, is that this undermines what Putin's political strategy has been, which is since his failure to take Kyiv, he's clearly tried to wage a war of attrition in which kind of inch by inch he consolidates control of territory in eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, consolidating a swath of land that connects down to Crimea, which the Russians occupied in 2014, and then weaponize energy, gas, and oil to punish those countries, particularly European countries that have been supporting Ukraine, and try to demoralize the Ukrainians through battlefield attrition and demoralize their supporters who are arming them in the West. And I think with this advance, it completely undermines Putin's argument that a war of attrition serves his interests. What the Ukrainians are showing to their own people is that they should have their morale up, that it's possible to beat the Russians back and to take back territory. And importantly, the Ukrainians are showing their Western allies, hey, look, if you continue to support us, if you even escalate your support for us, we can take back more territory. So it really shifts the dynamic on which this war is being fought.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's been the Ukrainian plight, I think, captured the U.S. and Europe's attention and imagination. Tremendous outpouring of solidarity. I think as time has gone by, it's obviously harder to maintain that attention. We've even seen protests against support of Ukraine in parts of Eastern Europe, and also they're now facing energy costs as a massive problem this winter. But the U.S. support does seem crucial here. I mean, both in terms of the money and the kinds of weapons they've been given, which are more offensive in nature and which Ukrainians have been asking for and had not gotten in the beginning, do seem to be playing a pretty significant role. You even heard it from that Russian commentator in these offenses as well.
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning, it was a lot of defensive weaponry, anti-tank weapons to try to repel Russian invasion. The U.S. shifted over the course of the war into providing the kind of long-range artillery that can be used to weaken, soften up Russian positions and enable an offensive, as well as providing more air defense systems that can allow those advancing Ukrainian forces to operate without as big a risk from Russian air power. So it's tilted some of the battlefield dynamic in favor of the Ukrainians. At the same time that I think part of what we've seen, Chris, and frankly, that Russian mentioned it in his own comments, is when you have a military that is full of conscripts who are poorly paid, who weren't even told why they're in these regions of Ukraine, and mercenaries who are being sent in there for hire. The morale among the Russian units who've been worn down by a lot of frontline fighting, clearly not high. Those guys hightailed it as soon as they could. Whereas the morale on the Ukrainian side and the will to fight has been very high and very resilient, and I think will be reinforced by these success. Success can beget success. Now, I caution, Russia still occupies a large swath of Ukrainian territory. They still have a lot of manpower and firepower. And the danger, frankly, is if Putin begins to feel like he's losing, does he resort to even more dramatic actions? And we've already seen that with the effort to kind of cut off power and kind of punish the Ukrainian people for the success of their military. So there's a long road ahead. But for the Ukrainians, I think they have hope. And hope is obviously an incredibly powerful force when you're dealing with this kind of existential conflict.
Well, and there's a deeper question here, which again, at some point, at some level, right? Like, I'm not a party to this. I think that the invasion was an atrocity and never should have happened. Has made the world worse. Has led to tens of thousands of avoidable deaths. And want to see Russia repelled from Ukraine. At the same time, the longer the war goes, the higher level of human misery. 6 months of this has already produced unbelievable amounts of destruction and death, both of the military on both sides and civilians. 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. We saw what happened in Syria, which is a 9-year battle. And I guess the question is, what is your assessment of the way this ends, given this offensive and what it might mean in terms of what a possible outcome could possibly be that would actually end this war?
Well, first of all, I think one of the reasons why President Zelensky and the Ukrainians were reticent to get into a peace negotiation in the previous months is they saw that in the areas that Russia was taking, that Russia was occupying, they were depopulating those areas. They were shipping Ukrainians into Russia, or they were just leveling the places. And so any negotiation that kind of started with the status quo where Russia's occupying those lands, Ukraine's not going to get those back. And frankly, those people are going to live under serious misery. I think what Ukraine wants is to gain back as much territory as they possibly can, so they're in a much stronger position when they enter into any peace negotiation. And that, hopefully, is how this can end.